prestige listeners. It is once again I, Derek. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Danny Bessner. Hello, Danny.
Hello, Derek. And why don't you tell the crowd why you sound like such shit?
Well, I'm sitting in the dark with no power, and so I'm calling into this meeting, having already been all set to go with the usual recording rig. There's not a drop of rain in the sky, or not a cloud in the sky, not a drop of rain on the ground, but our power has gone out anyway. So this possibly the beginning of the storm. Q may have prophesied this. I don't know. But I'll let you know. If there's somebody storms into my house later, I'll give you an update.
Everyone, Derek is just a black screen with a glint of glasses showing. It's very haunting, but it's good. It makes sense for the theme we're going to discuss today.
That's right. So we're joined, very lucky to be joined, by novelist, writer, podcast guest extraordinaire, Jacob Bacharach. Hello, Jacob.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And Matt Christman of the Chapo Trap House podcast and 3-time returning champion. You're our first third time guest. That's exciting.
Very honored. Thank you.
Yeah, Matt has been on 40% of our episodes.
So we're here because, frankly, I think the content of this podcast has been a little heavy. And so we're here to discuss something that is very much not heavy. A couple of weeks ago, Garry Kasparov, you may be familiar with Garry Kasparov, is the chess champion / resistance icon, hashtag the resistance icon, wrote an article about, in commemoration of Columbus Day, and about how all you people who call it Indigenous Peoples Day and rip on Christopher Columbus are assholes and should be ashamed of yourselves. And this is a long walk to get to why I thought we should do this episode. But immediately, as soon as this article sort of hit the internet and hit social media, people started to make some funny comments about Garry Kasparov's connection to what is called the New Chronology. This is a Russian pseudo-historical conspiracy kind of conglomerate thing that Kasparov has expressed some affinity toward in the past. And so the idea of him writing this kind of bullshit take on Columbus, I guess, triggered everybody to bring up his connection to the New Chronology. I thought, having seen that and had my memory jarred, been reminded of this thing, I thought it would make a nice topic for a little, shall we say, less heavy episode of the podcast that we could put out for our subscribers. So I was very excited to learn that Jacob knows something about the New Chronology, because it's not an area that I can talk about in any detail, but I was very excited to learn that he knows something about it, and I was very excited that Matt was able to come on the show. So I'm going to start by turning it over to Jacob, especially because I'm tired of sitting here in a dark room talking. Jacob, can you take us through the basic outlines of the New Chronology? What is it?
Sure. So the New Chronology is a pseudoscientific recasting of the written history of the world, promulgated by a Russian, former Soviet Russian mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko, and a couple of co-authors who came aboard a little bit later on. And we'll get into all of the, or at least some of the strange details probably later on. And it's expansive, so I don't even know half of the details. But effectively, the theory, which draws on a variety of other works dating really all the way back to the 17th century, posits that basically the majority of what we consider pre-modern history is a fabrication. That the events which we ascribe to classical antiquity in particular either did not occur or actually occurred in a very brief several hundred-year period occurring around the time of the early Middle Ages in Europe, that many of the historical characters and personages who appear in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, were in fact Greco-Russo-Turk characters who lived in the what we would probably call the beginning of the late Middle Ages. That most of world history centers around a what they call the Russian Horde, which is a Russo-Turkish empire which ruled the majority of the Asian landmass, and that all of this can be adduced basically through a method of statistical reasoning, which we can get into maybe a little bit later as well, because it's really funny how they claim to build this model. The upshot of the whole thing is that recorded history began around the year 800 AD. There was no classical antiquity. What we take to be history, the chronology of basically anything that occurred before about the year 1500, was a fabrication by Benedictine monks, the Vatican, and a variety of other shadowy cabals. Most
not the Jews. Not the Jews.
The Jews go pretty much unscathed.
Wow, this is pretty progressive.
Read. Yeah,
I might be a convert to the new chronology. I like what they're selling.
Yeah,
there's a space for me finally in the conspiracy.
Yeah, there's a place for us.
Representation matters.
So that's like the high level overview. This mathematician, two mathematicians, his co-author, a guy named Gleb Nosovsky, basically came upon these sort of revisionist chronologies through another kind of earlier 20th century Russian source. They began to take them a little bit more seriously. And then, as I said, they concocted this absolutely hilarious and very complex statistical mechanism for basically claiming that the reason history seems like it's so long is because multiple events which appear to occur in sequence, in fact, occurred simultaneously, or were the same event, all proven by statistical reasoning. And there we go. That's the new.
So that seems pretty airtight to me.
Basically, imagine history as like a conventional history as an accordion. The new chronology squeezes the accordion together, brings it all into one space.
Yes. So it makes quite a racket doing so.
Well, the argument is sort of, if you look at different historical accounts and they seem to correspond with one another in any way, that what you're actually reading are two different accounts of the same series of events, right? I mean, it's like he looks at, different periods of Italian history and decides that they all run in parallel, so they must just be different versions of the same sequence of events. For example.
And not just that, not just within the sort of reasonably small geography of something like, let's say Renaissance Italy, where you could at least on a case by case basis, perhaps make some sort of historical case that, maybe in the historic record of that period before the advent of like modern historiography, maybe sure, some things got repeated or some individuals were treated as being separate individuals when in fact they were the same person. On a very limited basis, that might be true. But I mean, here, like one of the claims, for example, is that the historic Jesus figure, is a composite figure composed of the Old Testament prophet Elisha, Pope Gregory VII, Saint Basil of Caesarea, Li Yanhua, who was an emperor of Western Xia in China, and that all of those people's attributes were then combined and attributed to an actual real-life guy called Andronikos, who was a Russo-Greek born in Crimea, and ultimately, and ultimately crucified in the historic city of Troy, which is in Turkey, in modern-day Turkey, which is also Jerusalem. I mean, it's amazing.
It's a stew. It's like a nice stew of everything you got in the refrigerator tossed in here to make a story.
The important thing is just make the Russians more relevant. You got to do it.
That's what I was going to ask, Matt. I was actually going to ask you. So this seems to me to be a product of this guy's born in 45, Anatoly Fomenko, and he really rises to prominence, it seems to be in the 1990s. And this is, of course, the moment of Russian decline, and shock therapy into the former Soviet Union. So, Matt, I know you're someone who thinks historically and things like that. So what do you think the longing, this seems to be like such an obvious psychological longing to place the Russians at the center of history at the very moment when history truly ended for them. It's the end of history from the other side, as some might say. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, because at the very moment that Russia is being forced to accept their ancillary role in the world, they're no longer going to be able to assert power and direct the flow of history. Then they have to fall back on something, and conventional history of Western civilization doesn't really have a lot for the Russians to do. So this is a good way to reimagine history in a way that reasserts the centrality of Russia to the human historical project.
Which is a funny thing when you think about it, because while I think that kind of that sort of psychological sketch of the rationale strikes me as accurate, at the same time, like any serious student certainly of modern history, like pretty much recognizes the centrality of Russia to that history. So it's a funny kind of project to sort of make one of the sort of fundamental axes around which world history for the last 1,000 years has revolved into an even more important axis of world history, to the extent that you claim that the Roman Empire never existed in effect.
Well, what's really interesting to me, what that seems like to me, and obviously to do some armchair psychologizing, is that during the Cold War, Russia, one of the main things that the Soviet Union did was present itself as sort of a civilizational anchor. Like even though in actual history, the Russian space, going back to Poland, Lithuania in the 13th century, has always been interacting with what became Western and Central Europe. But during the Cold War, both sides sort of constructed alternative civilizational paths. And in the U.S., you get like Judeo-Christianity, which was essentially invented during World War II to be a thing. And then in the Soviet side, you get sort of the Russian axis of history. And so what it seems to me in this way, what the new chronology is almost trying to do is sort of to de-civilizationize the Western victors in the Cold War by claiming that all civilization ultimately traces back to this Russian empire that is in a moment of decline in the 1990s, but through which all history passes. And so that leads me, and I genuinely just don't know about this. Like, why would someone like Kasparov be attracted to this? Like, what are his politics? I see his name pop up and it seems like kind of reactionary, but what does this guy think? And why would someone with that profile be attracted to this approach? Because he's like kind of a defector in a sense, but he's also like, his life is, it's interesting. His life is made as sort of a Russian in the United States. And that's an interesting positionality.
Yeah. I think that so first of all, if you pay attention to Garry Kasparov, and particularly to his pronouncements on politics, he's definitely in that sort of, don't believe what you're told. Ask questions, question the narrative kind of guy, which, can lead people into some true revelations, like particularly about the conduct of the United States of America in the globe over the last 250 years, but can also lead you into some very funny places. And Kasparov, whenever he was a little more in the 90s, he was a little more sort of openly curious about the new chronology. And since then, partly because he's come under a lot of criticism for it, he's sort of backed off a bit and said, well, I'm just saying we need to ask questions and we need to question official narratives in history. There's one thing I learned as a Soviet citizen. It's that history can be changed and weaponized for the purposes of control. Again, which is true. But you can take that sort of legitimate questing into a sort of crackpot contrarianism, in which, in some ways, I think the more revisionist and the more far out the theory, and the more tentacular and ubiquitous the conspiracy is, the more attractive it becomes. So I think that it's kind of, it's a person who wants to question narratives, but is not being parsimonious at all in terms of what is and is not true. So is willing to buy, for instance, into this idea that, the Russian horde controlled the Eurasian landmass and was never under the Mongol yoke, for example, or that the sort of Western history of Christianity is basically a history of fabrication, and that the true history of Christianity is not only more recent than we've been told, but is fundamentally Greco-Russian, therefore Orthodox, rather than Western and Catholic.
Which builds precisely on the Soviet civilizational model, in a sense, right? It's an update for a post-Soviet world. And I was wondering, why do you guys think the chronological aspect of it is what's very interesting to me? Because it's usually, when you get revisionist histories, it's taking like the basic chronology of what we suspect the last 5,000 years or so has been. But why do you think this focus on a transformation in the chronology, that it actually happened way more recently than what, the mainstream would have you believe? The chronological focus is interesting.
Well, so I kind of mentioned in my somewhat rambling introduction, this is a theory that actually has roots that stretch back pretty far in Western Europe. So, the history of chronology as a sort of subdiscipline of history, I guess, really begins in the church, and begins with efforts dating all the way back to the very earliest days of the church, to like some of the Greek church fathers before even the organization of the Western church. And, as an attempt to basically calculate and understand the chronological history of the world as told from creation in the Old Testament. And so beginning with like scholars like Eusebius and St. Jerome, they begin basically trying to line up the events, the birthdays, etc., as described in the Old Testament, to create these chronologies. And these continue to be elaborated, going right up into the Middle Ages, until you have actually in the sort of very early modern period, I guess in the late 16th, early 17th century, you have this French Calvinist named Joseph Scaliger, who basically constructs the first real chronology of Western history, including sort of biblical times, classical antiquity from original classical sources that have been unearthed or rediscovered during the Renaissance, as well as contemporaneous historical accounts. So he does this, and it forms basically the basis of chronology until modern methods are invented, like by German archaeologists sometime.
Leopold von Ranke
in
the 19th century, a father of history. Leopold von Ranke.
So this French Calvinist constructs this timeline, and almost immediately you begin seeing these revisionists who basically come in and start saying that the classical sources are spurious, the attribution of things to ancient times, classical antiquity, are inaccurate, that these things occurred more closely to the present than we suspected them, that the age of the world is perhaps not as long as some of these still religious, but nevertheless like somewhat more modern folks were beginning to suspect. And so, in the 17th and 18th century, there's a bunch of revisionist chronology that goes on in Europe, in England, in France, in Germany. All of this stuff somehow gets rediscovered by this crackpot Russian named Nikolai Morozov, who's a fascinating character. He's this communist revolutionary. He was like a member of the Circle of Tchaikovsky. He wrote for like Land and Liberty.
What's the Circle of Tchaikovsky? Forgive my ignorance.
The Circle of Tchaikovsky was like a pre-revolutionary sort of like intellectual salon for communists and socialists of various stripes in the sort of like, I think around the like 1880s or 1890s.
Oh, okay. So in its formation, pre-Bolshevik mentioned early.
So this guy was born in like in the 1850s. So he eventually runs afoul of the Tsar. He gets imprisoned in the Peter and Paul Fortress. Who doesn't? He gets imprisoned in the Peter and Paul Fortress for a while. He goes into exile, which he spends in England and Germany, where he actually meets and becomes acquaintances with Karl Marx. He eventually returns to Russia, participates in the revolution, then becomes a scholar. As a scholar...
In the 17 Revolution, in 1917, not 1905.
Yeah, in the 17 Revolution.
So he's an old man. He's in his 70s. He's almost 70.
He's got to be... So he's born in 54. So he's 63. He's in his 60s then. After the revolution, he goes off to Petrograd and works at an academic institution there. He begins to do research and develop these theories that the Christian chronology promulgated by the Scaliger figure is all wrong. Eventually, Morozov becomes the oldest sniper in the Red Army in World War II.
This is a great story.
It's incredible.
In his 80s and 90s.
He was 88 years old when he enlisted in the Red Army and became a sniper.
Was he plunking dudes in a rocking chair?
No, I think he invented a telescopic sight for sniper rifles.
Yeah, he was
of his own design, and like insisted on being allowed to serve as a sniper in the siege of Stalingrad.
Yeah, he was an early contributor. He was a member of the Russian Aeronautic Society in the teens. I mean, he did a little bit of everything, and eventually he dies at the age of 92 after the war.
That is an awesome time for an old communist to die. Jesus Christ. Like, you just defeated fascism. The Soviet Union controls it. He died happy. Good for him. So, he died at the height.
So he wrote two books that revised the Christian chronology. One of them called Revelations in Storm and Tempest, and one of them called The Prophets. And in those books, he dated a lot of biblical occurrences to more modern times. And then, lo and behold, like, another 25, 40 years later, this Russian mathematician, Anatoly Fomenko, rediscovers these works, takes them up.
What year does he rediscover them? Do you know? Because I do feel like that's crucial. Is it in the mid 80s or mid 90s?
It was in the mid 80s.
Okay, so it's like hyper-normalization Russia.
Yeah.
Soviet. The Soviet Union's ordering armies that don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Weird time.
It was before the collapse, obviously. But it was in the 80s. He wrote some articles about it before he ultimately wrote this monstrous 7-volume collection of books called History, Fiction, or Science. What he developed over this period of time between when he began to be interested and when he ultimately wrote these books is a statistical methodology where they concluded that, let's see if I can describe this, that the more important events in history were more notable and therefore are treated at greater length in works of history or works of historiography. So written works of history treat important events at greater length than less important events. And they treat important years at greater length than less important years. So they basically concocted, in effect, an algorithm that compared the amount of time and the amount of pages that works of history spent on different historical occurrences, and then, in effect, ran a fairly primitive statistical analysis that compared the amount of pages devoted to different, supposedly, in their view, supposedly disparate events, and if they were statistically similar enough, concluded that those events were probably the same event. It is amazing. It's like if it's like if Nate Silver were like an ex-Soviet mathematician and was concocting the now meter or whatever his aggregate of all poles is, but as a mechanism for comparing all of history and then saying there's a 74% chance that Romulus and Ulysses were the same person. It's incredible.
Based on a very strange analysis of length of treatment in written history, which is extraordinarily weird.
This sounds kind of like historical sabermetrics.
Yes,
like these guys are getting in there with Nate Silver, really wrestling with the data.
Yeah, you got to aggregate all of the works of history, and then and compare them, and by aggregating them and comparing them, you can determine which of them are likely to be the same. And in so doing, if you ever look at the books, unfortunately, podcasting is not a visual medium. But if you look at the books that they wrote, there are these really beautiful. They almost look like economists' graphs, but these great kind of like, to use your analogy, Matt, like little like accordion diagrams that show where history compresses and expands, and shows in so doing, by putting those things side by side, how these seemingly disparate events at disparate periods actually occurred at the same time and were therefore the same event.
So this leads me to ask, how do they respond to the obvious critiques and criticisms? And what has the attraction been? It seems very strange to me. Like the critiques of this are obvious. So what's their response?
Well, their response...
The critique would be, this makes absolutely no sense. There's no correlation or connection between length of historical treatment and when something happened in time. And why would this algorithm tell us anything about true chronology?
Yeah, well, the answer is, I think, and I think it's apt that we're talking about them in comparison to modern statisticians and economists, maybe, because I think, first of all, they basically say, and speaking of things being spurious, they basically say that any contribution from outside of their own analysis is itself spurious. So like radiocarbon dating is just not true.
Well, I'll do it.
Yeah. Tree ring chronology is simply not true, right? That their analysis, that all that exists is textual analysis, and that anything that appears to contradict it, in fact, does not only does not contradict it, but proves it. It demonstrates it. And so, the psychology for why people believe it, I don't know. Why are people flat earthers? I think that it's obscurantism, and it's incredibly radical departure from the accepted, the sort of like accepted progression of history, particularly of history in the Christian West, is attractive precisely because it's so radically upends in the minds of its adherents everything you've been taught is wrong. Everything you've been told is wrong. The figures of authority have pulled a veil over your eyes, and a secret history lies just beyond it. Which, if you can apprehend it, it gives you not just a sort of special knowledge, but a special power. Even though, in fact, you're just some weirdo reading a 7-volume, multi-1,000-page fake history that, among other things, proposes that the Habsburgs were, in fact, the Khanate of Novgorod. I mean, it's amazing when the further you dig in.
What's so interesting to me is that it reminds me a lot of the Bible code. Do you guys remember that in the mid-1990s when someone would do it like an algorithmic analysis of the entire Tanakh, and then they would say like Bibi Netanyahu will become prime minister in 1997, or Yitzhak. I remember a big one. Yitzhak Rabin would be murdered by Yigal Amir. But what I mean by that is because it's doing two things that you don't usually see come together, which is one hand, you have the extreme fetishization of quantification, which is like the modern condition. And Theodore Porter, for listeners who are interested, wrote a really interesting book called Trust in Numbers, which shows like why numbers in particular became sort of fetish objects for modernity, where someone like Nate Silver could claim to, algorithmically determine human behavior in a meaningful way. This is, on one hand, the dream of modernity, and that's always connected to unlocking something secret. But what's interesting is that in this case, and also in the case of the Bible Code, is that it's a quantitative analysis of text. So you have the extreme fetishization of writing and text, which is usually placed in contradiction actually to quantitative analysis, right? I'm a professor, and so what you usually see, for example, is, STEM and the humanities put on opposite sides of the equation. And in some sense, it's like the digital humanities, it's foreshadowing the digital humanities, and that is doing this heavy quant analysis of this text, and which seems to me it's almost dialectical in its approach. And I wonder if that's a part of its appeal, the way that it brings everything in from different perspectives. I mean, that's more of a comment than a question, but it seems like an important aspect of this whole thing.
Yeah, I go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Jacob. I have another parallel to draw. But
yeah. Well, I do wonder too if there is a bit of, I agree with what you say, but I also wonder if there's a bit of a post-Soviet element there as well. Because, I can say actually many fairly admirable things about the Soviet Union, but one thing that is certainly true, is that there was there as well a sort of, a fetishization for quantitative analysis, despite, the, many contributions to the humanistic disciplines of the Russians and the Soviets. And I do wonder if, lacking some of the, at least during the Soviet period, having some of the, mechanisms of sort of textual analysis that became popularized in the West, including around like historiography, basically not being knowable or teachable, if the idea of exposing these kind of, these historical textual documents to this kind of rigorous mathematical and scientific analysis, which is certainly something that the Soviets were very, very good at, also plays into the fact that these kind of post-Soviet mathematicians basically presumed that they could apply the same mechanisms that they applied to like complex problems in topography to complex problems in historical discrepancy.
Yeah, and famously in the Soviet Union, particularly the earlier Soviet Union, a lot of like people who might have gotten into what might be called like a critical theory or critical social theory were pushed toward the sciences. That's like a historical phenomenon that historians, I believe, have exposed. So that might also be part of it. But has this become part of like internet lore? Matt, have you, in your traipsing through the internet, have you ever come across this shit in like history internet? Because I think I had like glimpsed it, but never, straight on.
I've only seen it commented on from outside. I don't encounter enough Slavic irredentists to have encountered this straight.
It's a niche.
Head on.
It's a niche group.
Exactly. Like
that's your first.
I
problem.
probably have probably seen it mostly in YouTube comments for videos of the Serbian artillery being guided by God or something, but not directly, because it has a very specific provincial motivation that is not necessarily going to grab Western crackpots.
There's a theory, and now that I'm back on a decent recording and the lights are back on, I can talk about this. Yeah, just to update the listeners. When I was reading about this and the sort of Russian nationalist aspects of it really paralleled to me. This is a little more esoteric, but there's a movement that took place in Turkey after World War I, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, as the Turkish Republic was forming. There was a lot of work done to kind of in terms of Turkish nationalism, kind of to kind of pump up the idea of the Turks as a historical, dominating type of people. But there was also a considerable amount of work that went into kind of Arabizing and de-Persianizing the Turkish language. And so what happened was you had a lot of scholars going into the vocabulary and trying to excise these loan words from the Turkish language, which of course, for people who had spent their entire lives speaking Ottoman Turkish, which is heavily inflected with Arabic and Persian, suddenly like they were illiterate, like they couldn't communicate anymore in the official, the new Turkish. So what happened was a scholar in one of the Turkish universities came up with a theory. It's called the Sun language theory, which postulated that all language went back to this primordial need for human beings to describe religious totems. And the first religious totem would have been the sun. And so they needed a word to describe the sun to worship. And it just so happened under this theory that the first people to look up and try to worship the sun were the Turks. And so the Turks in Turkish was the font of all languages, basically. Like this was the first spoken language, which meant that not only were the Turks kind of the uber, kind of the earliest people to speak and therefore kind of the root of all human civilization. But it also meant that all these loan words, these Arabic and Persian loan words that had been kicked out of the Turkish language could be brought back in. And suddenly it was okay to speak them again because in fact, they were all Turkish words. All words are Turkish. If you cut
so
down to the
interesting.
chase. And it really reminded me of that. That's one of these like wild, theories that happens at the fall of an empire, basically, where you're sort of scrambling for meaning and trying to remind yourselves that this is a great society that we live in and we have a great history, and you latch onto stuff like this.
Do you think Q, I mean, to Derek, but really to everyone, do you think Q is reflecting something similar here, something of that impulse, or is it appreciably different as a conspiracy theory? Because this is basically a conspiracy theory and we live in an era of conspiracies. So I was wondering if you thought, like, you see any parallels to the panel. Do you see any parallels here?
I mean, everybody needs some way to make sense of their world, and there's decreasing ability to feel like you have any real control over the narrative of life in the received understanding of the world that you're presented with. So if you do want to do like the work of shaping the world around you and redefining it in a way that is more emotionally satisfying, you basically have to start freeballing it, because there's just so little there's so little latitude in sort of conventional understandings. So I think what they have in common is they're all the product of that human urge to make sense of a world, not on the terms of sort of an alienated consensus, but on your own individual terms and on people that you trust more.
Well, I said, I think I actually, when you first reached out to me about this, I think I said this to you in our chat, and it's a subject that I know is near and dear to Matt's heart. But actually, to me, one of the most interesting American parallels is actually probably Mormonism.
Oh, hell yes.
which is because if you look at the new chronology, I mean, at its historical roots, right, and particularly at its obsession, its supreme interest in the sort of place of Rome and the Church and Christianity. It's effectively constructing and concocting a parallel Christianity, one that centers in this case the sort of like Russo-Slavic or Greco-Russian like orthodoxy in not just like the history of modern of organized Christianity, but of the actual like entire sort of biblical history of what we would call Judeo-Christianity in the U.S. And I see it's not that different from Mormonism, which constructs this kind of like parallel revelation in which, well, sure, kind of that other stuff happened. I mean, the Old Testament happened and Jesus happened in the way that we were taught in the New Testament. But in fact, there was this superseding historical occurrence in America. And that is in fact the central story of Christian redemption, and of the spiritual development of humankind. And I think we see something parallel in the Russian context, in the way that it basically tries to wrench the Near Eastern and Mediterranean and then ultimately Western European sort of received history of the development of Christianity, and basically say none of that ever happened. It was all invented by monks in order to distract from the true spiritual history of this religion and this civilization, which all occurred more like in the Black Sea area and the Eurasian steppe.
Yeah, like Mormonism is partially a result of Americans trying to struggle with living a religious tradition whose origin story was so alien to a country that in all of their minds was the center and pivot point of the human race. I mean, it's a way to square that incongruity. The Garden of Eden was in Missouri, actually.
Yeah. And Russia, in Russia, dating back to like the 16th century, there's been this kind of this notion of the Russians and of Moscow as this sort of like successor to Rome. So there's the famous, there have been three Romes: Rome, Byzantium, and Moscow. There will not be a fourth, which is like ingrained in like real, orthodox like eschatology. And
we actually say that at the beginning of every episode.
Yes, really? Absolutely.
It's partly funny because again, the new chronology basically posits that Rome proper never really. I mean, it existed, but its history never existed. So that's
like a title, right? It's not an actual place. It's like an honorific that you can give to different cities over the course of history.
Yes, exactly.
But what's interesting, though, when you compare it to Mormonism, so as a historian, this is where my mind goes. And in some sense, I think the parallels that Matt pointed out are exactly right. And Jacob, obviously, what you said in terms of the parallel structures is correct. But they're very different moments. Mormons is obviously the moment of imperial expansion, right? The moment of domination and domineering of this particular continent. And sort of the Fomenkoism or the new chronology, though it had these sort of strange organs with Morozov, is really the product of almost the exact opposite moment, the moment of, failure, when the prophecy had failed. So that's interesting when you're talking about macro, but in some sense, they're both responding to failed prophecies. In essence, they're both
I think they're all of these things are attempts to find meaning in a world where you're struggling to figure out what the meaning is. And I mean, Mormonism, partly, and I learned this from listening to Matt's, podcast on Mormonism. I mean, part of Mormonism is, trying to square the contradictions between, this capitalist paradise that we're living in and Christianity, which are not really that compatible with one another. And so, you have this disconnect in your head and you fill that disconnect with, what winds up being Mormonism. It's the same thing with, the new chronology. It's the collapse of, the Soviet Union, the collapse really, the final end of the Russian Empire. And there's a struggle to find meaning in that. And you go to this idea of the Russian horde as the center of all human history. And the Sun language, thing, the same type of thing. It's at a time of collapse when people are trying to make sense of the world.
Yeah. And I'd be curious, Matt, what you think about this. I mean, I agree that like Mormonism is born during a moment of imperial expansion. I mean, because we haven't yet, reached we're still in a period of imperial expansion. Maybe the rubber band is getting a little bit worn out, but it's still being stretched. But at the same time, it seems to me like Mormonism's birth and certainly its kind of like early midlife actually occurred at a moment of like real like sectional schismatisms in the U.S. and real and different existential questions than obviously like the Soviets were asking in like the mid 80s, but nevertheless like at a moment where the question of whether or not the sort of extant order of the United States would continue as it was, or effectively collapse. I mean, that's why they tried to create their like desert kingdom out there or something.
Right. Well, that's the thing. Yeah. When they did the exodus to Utah, at that point, Utah was technically part of Mexico. So they were imagining that they could, after struggling and failing to assimilate into American society, Joseph Smith was actually killed by a mob while he was also running for president of the United States in 1844. And his followers then decided, well, if we cannot create a community of faith that is in harmony with America, and maybe even convince Americans to be more like us, which was one of the key motivations of the presidential run that Smith carried out, then we're going to have to do it ourselves. We're going to have to take some of that land out there and make it our own. And then they were eventually just absorbed into the continually westward expanding America. But yeah, at the time, I think there was probably a hope that they'd be able to establish some sort of independent domain. But very quickly they got eaten up.
And what's interesting to me about both of these, especially as Jacob presented it and as Matt talked about it, is that the choice to do it through chronology to me is very interesting. It's very Enlightenment. It's very rationalistic, and I wish that I was a historian of time, but how people conceive of time and how people conceive of chronology is absolutely central to remaking their worldview. So it doesn't surprise me that both the Mormons and sort of the post-Soviet mathematicians are really trying to reconstruct like almost their ontology. It's in some sense an ontological revolution, exploring the very nature of being in a new way, and that's very compelling as a thing that humans do, particularly in revolutionary moments. And my mind, of course, immediately goes to the French Revolutionary Calendar. Reforming time in moments of revolution is an absolutely central thing, I think.
Yeah, because if you have command over time, like you have signaled your ability to dictate like the terms of reality as opposed to accepting them.
Yes. And I think that what's interesting is that this did come at that moment of that kind of neoliberal shock therapy moment in Russian history. And what's interesting is that even though like nobody in power, at least that I'm aware of, this theory has some legs in Russia. I mean, it's not like Russian QAnon. I don't think it has those kind of legs, but it definitely has some native following, but it certainly hasn't been taken up by the sort of official Russian state, so to speak. But there are some things about it that do anticipate the interesting religious and political merger that you see occurring in the sort of Putin era Russia, in which the sort of like entrenched power of the Putin oligarchic system and the power and wealth of the renewed Russian Orthodox Church have become intertwined in a lot of ways, and the church itself has become, in many ways, one of the pillars of the legitimacy of the Putin-centric political system there. And I think that some of the topical interests of the new chronology, even if the actual chronology itself kind of gets tossed out the window, provide a sort of an interesting precursor and parallel to the way that the church has been sort of rehabilitated and reintegrated into the sort of capitalist Russian political system.
So we actually haven't done much on the content of the new chronology. I'm sure that's a very large topic, but Jacob, what are the greatest hits? Because I imagine there's a lot of humdingers in this one that are pretty interesting.
Yeah,
the identity of Jesus is probably the greatest of the hits, but yeah, there's several other ones.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the idea that that kind of like the central power in world history and in Eurasian history was Russian horde. So not the Kievan Rus, not Moscow, not any of the actual historical kind of precursors to Russia, but like that a fairly what would in effect be a fairly like modern Russian identity, in fact, dominated like the Eurasian steppe throughout all history, and that the people who we think were there, the Mongols and Scythians and all the others, were in fact Russians.
The Huns, the Pechenegs, the Bulgars, all these people are in fact Russian.
They're all Russian. Yeah.
So that's where it starts, and this is the Fomenko series. Essentially, this isn't Morozov.
Yeah, this is the Fomenko. Yeah, this is Fomenko.
Vintage Fomenko.
I will. I'll give you a couple examples that are maybe not like. I'm not going to actually call them the greatest hits. I mean, the identity of Jesus as some Greek guy born in the Crimean Peninsula is a pretty funny.
What was it, Andronicus?
That's pretty good. Yeah, Andronicus Komnenos. Yeah, Andronicus the first.
Yeah, born in 1152, born 1,152 years after his own death. That's a good one. I do like the fact that they say that the Hagia Sophia is the Temple of Solomon, and
that's a good one.
And that actually Solomon is Suleiman the Magnificent.
Is Suleiman the Magnificent?
Oh wow! Really so around the 1,000 year, it's around the early.
Which is Crusades, that's even wilder because Suleiman lived 300 years after Andronicus Komnenos, so we're postulating that King Solomon was actually lived after Jesus is fascinating.
Yeah, but let me. So two of my favorite little details from the series. So I've read the first book of their history, fiction or science volumes.
That's a septology. What's it called?
It's called history. Yeah, it's a septology. History, fiction, or science. The first volume alone is well over 600 pages, and written in textbook format too. So it's 2 columns of text on every page. So it is a lot of text. But a couple of my favorite, these are kind of like just little like off the wall claims in it. But I think I mentioned earlier, one is that Romulus and Ulysses were the same person. And that's because the founding of Rome, in their estimation, cannot be dated within 500 years and could have occurred as much as 500 years before the claim, and that the Homeric epics occurred 500 or maybe even 1,000 years after they were supposed to have occurred, and therefore these two people are the same person, and they founded Rome. And that actually happened like in the year 800 AD. Right, so
do you know what I think? It's interesting here because what they're doing is they're building on an insight of biblical criticism, which is that like Gilgamesh and Noah's Ark story both contain, mythos of ancient floods, right? So that's, I think, what they're building on. There's like this insight of 19th century, event that they're now making about everything.
Yeah.
There's also a repeated, and Fomenko's not the only one who has done stuff like this, but there's this idea that you can square basically mythological accounts with recorded history, and so you're trying to fit Homer into the chronology somehow, and this goes on. On smaller scales in other fields, like, there's a lot of alternative dating theories in Egyptology to try to make the Egyptological record match up with the Old Testament and things like that. So it's, it's something that recurs in these kinds of attempts to rewrite the timeline.
I won't hear you say anything bad against Stargate SG-1 now.
Documentary.
But no, okay. So another really funny one is they have some images in the book of Pompeian graffiti, because that's one of the counterexamples that they set up and knocked down like duckpin bowling. Right? They say, well, some people will say that look, Pompeii is this perfectly preserved Roman town, and it almost definitionally like shows this pre-modern classical society. But actually, it proves quite the opposite, because if you look at the graffiti, it demonstrates that Pompeii, yeah, it was real, but it was real in the Middle Ages, and it was destroyed by a volcano in the Middle Ages. And the way that they do this is they show several images, several bits of graffiti that were discovered at Pompeii, which appear to show figures in tall hats and robe-like garb, pulling other figures up onto a scaffold. And they say these people are obviously Catholic priests, right? They adduce from this image that these people, because of their tall hats and robes, are Catholic priests. And therefore, this occurred during the Middle Ages. Now, you guys all know that of course, Catholic priests wear what they do because they were copying the garb worn by the Romans. It's a direct line of lineage between these two things. But to Fomenko, this is demonstrable proof that this event, this catastrophe of classical antiquity, in fact, occurred during what we think of as the Middle Ages. And another one I really love is at one point, this is like a great bit of question making. They say, besides which, all of these accounts of Bronze Age civilization cannot possibly be true, because nobody had discovered the use of metallic tin in the Bronze Age. Now, of course they had, because you need tin to make bronze. But
what?
But so according to them, bronze wasn't discovered until the Middle Ages. Therefore, what we attribute to Bronze Age society could not have occurred, because they couldn't have produced bronze, because they didn't discover tin until it was discovered in the Middle Ages, at which point all of the things that happened during the Bronze Age actually did happen, even though they would have been happening simultaneously with Iron Age and the Age of Gunpowder.
Right, with people wearing like iron armor and things. Yeah, that's
Wait a minute,
right.
so does this mean that Blackbeard is one of the sea people?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
That's a good title for a book about it.
The Bronze Age collapse was caused by Long John Silver.
This is so wild. So this is just total off the wall stuff. Just really not good use of algorithm.
Or a great use of algorithm.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's the ideal use, actually, for algorithm.
Yeah, have some fun with it. What else? What, are you going to learn about what actually happened? What's the fun in that?
Yeah, I guess
Make a new world in your head.
How is this different from like learning who, like, Matt, Tywin the Brave was in Game of Thrones? What's his name? Yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing.
Only you're doing it with this world instead of one that's made up. That's so much cooler.
Yeah, that is cooler. Have there been any like adaptations of this, like fictionalized adaptations or Russian TV shows about? Seems like this is ripe for IP.
Yeah, not that I know of. It would be great. I mean, in my mind, it would be more of a sort of like a kind of prestige, like Russian answer to the Name of the Rose, in which a brilliant scholar goes into the library and discovers that all of the things that he's been told by his religious superiors all of his life are not true. Solving a dastardly murder using the statistical comparative textual methods of the new chronology.
That's such a good idea. That's like hyper postmodern. Oh my God, Jacob, you should write that. That's a great idea.
It should have like flashbacks to like the siege of Troy, with Achilles using like a matchlock musket, before the walls of Troy.
Yeah, the genres could be blended.
Yeah.
Like have the In the Name of the Rose part, that sort of investigation mystery, and then you could retell the story, the history of the world on the largest canvas possible.
Yeah, Abraham and his sons and the Hebrew tribe, all armed with arquebusiers, enforcing at gunpoint the neighboring tribe to get circumcised.
That's an opening scene. If I were a Hollywood exec, I'd buy that.
All right, guys. So I think that's have we exhausted this? Jacob, do you have any more tidbits to share, or is this a good place to call it a day?
No, I mean, I think that about wraps it up. I guess I would just say that always examine the provenance of the writers who are hired to do guest columns for the Wall Street Journal editorial pages.
It's a very good warning. Words to live by. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us, Jacob and Matt. Really appreciate it. American Prestige listeners, we'll see you on the flip side.
Yeah. Das Vidania, Tovarishi.